Anthony had heard that he was here in California on a business trip. His family had given him 1,001 warnings not to mess with the Hunts. The attitude of the crowd changed drastically. Lawrence didn't understand why his boss had taken such a personal interest in the scene, but since he had set out the rules, they had to be enforced. He cleared his throat, raised his chin, and called out to the crowd. "How dare you try to start a fight at Hotel Finest? What's wrong with you all? Get out!" The chastened crowd began to hurry away. When Nora saw that Angela was also preparing to escape with the rest of the group, a sharp look flashed across her eyes. She grabbed Angela's arm. "Angela, there's something you haven't said yet." Angela was already in a panic by this point. She glanced at Justin fearfully, wishing only to leave quickly. She lowered her voice and returned. "Quit acting crazy. Let go of me." "Okay." Nora let go of her arm. Angela heaved a sigh of relief, but as she turned away and was about to leave, a huge force struck her from behind, knocking the wind out of her. Angela hit the table in front of her and fell to the ground. She felt as if all her internal organs were aching. Stunned, she thought, "Did Nora just kick me?" Nora walked over and grabbed her by the hair. In a fervent tone, she said, "Do you remember what you wanted to tell me now?" Angela's eyes widened. Desperately, she shouted, "She's attacking me, Mr. Hunt." Justin frowned. That woman's kick had been unexpectedly powerful. She seemed to have some pretty good moves, which made him feel as if his rescue had been a wasted effort. Before he could say anything, Lawrence stepped forward to reprimand her. "Fighting is prohibited in Hotel Finest, Miss Smith. Do you have no regard for Mr. Hunt's rules?" Nora looked up slightly. She had an innocent expression on her face, as if she were the most well-behaved and sensible person in the room. She replied softly, "But I'm just one person. She had the whole crowd coming for me. I was scared. It was self-defense." Frightened, Angela screamed, "Help!" Out of the corner of her eye, Nora could see a couple of Angela's more loyal friends trying to approach them. She glanced at them coldly and said, "Are you ignoring the rules? Coming after me again?" They backed away slowly. Seeing that no one would try and interrupt them again, she looked down at Angela. She hadn't planned to be harsh. They were still half-sisters after all. She had only wanted to know the whereabouts of her son. But now that she knew Angela and her mother had played a part in sabotaging her as a child, messing with her hormones when she was only 5, the fury she felt outweighed her sense of restraint. She sprinted toward a meek-looking Angela and hissed in a dreadful voice, "If you continue to keep silent, I'll beat you up so bad you won't even recognize yourself anymore." A trembling Angela couldn't hold it in anymore. She burst into tears and said, "I'll talk. I'll talk. I'll tell you what I know about your other child." "That whole situation with your other child. Dad was the one that handled it. He never told me any details. I don't know anything." Angela was sobbing so hard that Nora could barely understand what she was saying. Everyone else was too far away to hear their conversation. Nora frowned slightly, frightening Angela so badly that she cried out, "I really don't know. I swear, you can break my nose if it turns out I'm lying." Angela had been vain since she was a child. Nora knew she would never risk her good looks over a lie. Nora couldn't hide her disappointment, but she couldn't be bothered to waste any more time on this. So she stood up and slowly walked out. When she passed by Justin, Nora thought of how he'd rushed in to defend her. She had thanked him by getting violent herself. She wondered if he was embarrassed by her behavior. She wanted to explain. She turned her head to look at Justin. He was looking back at her, his eyes deep and unfathomable. Nora thought for a moment. Once she knew what she wanted to say, her lips parted. But the moment she opened her mouth, she couldn't suppress a wide yawn. Justin was rendered speechless. Next to him, Lawrence was furious. It was bad enough she attacked that other woman and Mr. Hunt just let it happen. But now she's yawning in his face? Who does she think she is? She's really pushing her luck. As soon as the thought appeared in his mind, the woman spoke. "Sorry, I wasn't trying to cause trouble for you, Mr. Hunt." The corners of Lawrence's lips spasmed a little. He thought dismissively, only a fool would believe that. He was just about to give her a sarcastic reply when he heard his boss's simple, icy-cold reply, "Uh-huh." Lawrence was confused. Her explanation was finished. Nora continued on her way. Justin stared at her as she walked away and narrowed his eyes. The woman's actions just now had been decisive and straightforward, and hadn't been sloppy in the least. They had seemed calculated. But it also seemed like she hadn't gotten what she wanted, and she looked a little sad. He found himself feeling compelled to help her. While he was contemplating this unexpected reaction, he heard Lawrence snort, "It's a good thing you stopped those rich brats from ganging up on her. Otherwise, Miss Smith might have beaten them all to a pulp." Justin didn't respond. Lawrence continued, "I hope she didn't think you were going out of your way just to save her. She's already currying favor with Pete to get close to you. If she takes this the wrong way, it'll be even harder to shake her off." Justin gave him a frosty look. "Keep your advice to yourself." Meanwhile, Cherry had made her way to the cafe. She was wearing a t-shirt, overalls, cowboy hat, and sunglasses. From head to toe, she looked adorable and endearing. She bounced into the cafe and picked up her cell phone to find that Chesty had sent her several text messages. "Are you here yet? You're already 10 minutes late. I hope you're not running away. Are you secretly an amazingly hot girl or something?" Cherry was about to reply when she received a call from Chesty. She picked up and said, "I'm here, Chesty. Table 25, 26, 28. Chester was already seated there with 3 empty glasses in front of him, bored out of his mind. Yeah, table 28. That's right. You're here. Where are you?" "Look down." He looked down and saw the top of a cowboy hat. His gaze continued down past the brim of the hat to see the incredibly familiar face of his nephew, Pete. Chester was perplexed. He rubbed his eyes and opened them again. The child was still there in front of him. He became even more confused, and he nervously said into the phone, "Leader?" "I'm here, Chesty." Beside him was the small child speaking in a high-pitched voice. Through his cell phone, he could hear the same voice. Chester collapsed back into his chair as if he had just seen a ghost. He looked at Cherry incredulously and stammered, "Leader?" Cherry blinked her big round eyes. "Uh-huh, that's me." She hadn't expected to find out that her uncle was Chesty either. The two of them had even had pizza with her father. Cherry ended the call on her phone, climbed into the chair opposite, and sat down. Then she said to a waitress, "A glass of milk, please. I'm still growing up, so I can't drink coffee. Thank you." The waitress's heart melted into a puddle of goo at the sight of the grinning little kid. "Sure, kiddo, just a moment." She quickly ran off to get the milk. Chester felt as if the sky was falling. He couldn't believe that this confident little kid was really his nephew. Pete had always been so shy and clumsy with words. Has he just been pretending to be a quiet kid all this time? Is he just messing with his dad? It was bad enough that Chester himself was messing around playing games all day long. But Pete was the one and only grandson of the Hunt family. He was Justin's only son. If Justin found out that he had been playing games with Pete, Chester swallowed hard. He felt like a dead man walking. Chester shuddered. Suddenly, he jumped to his feet anxiously. Shit, it's already 8:30. Justin will be getting back soon. You have to hurry and get back upstairs to do your homework, or your dad's going to kill us both. He threw $30 on the table, grabbed Cherry by the hand, and ran out of the cafe with her as if they were competing in a sprint. But as he reached the hotel lobby, he spotted Justin exiting the bar with a group of bodyguards and waiting by the elevator. Chester was shocked. He let go of Chesty's hand and said, "Go up the stairs to the second floor while I stop Justin. After that, hurry up to the top floor, and don't let anyone find you." Without waiting for Cherry to reply, Chester rushed toward Justin, trying to suppress his nervous, jittery energy. "I need to have a talk with you, Justin." Justin asked, "What kind of talk?" Chester braced himself against his brother's icy gaze, bit the bullet, and said, A heart-to-heart talk. I'm not available right now, Justin said coldly and entered the elevator. Chester followed him in. To buy more time, he pressed the elevator buttons for every floor in a panic. It'll only take a little of your time, Justin. Justin narrowed his eyes and said with mild displeasure, This had better be important. Justin, I think Chester racked his brains, but he couldn't think of any troubles that he had. Finally, he mumbled out, I don't like women. He was dumbfounded that was all he'd been able to come up with. Thankfully, he'd mumbled so quietly that Justin wasn't sure he'd heard him right. When his brother asked him to repeat himself, he panicked. No, I don't know what I'm saying, Justin. Chester rambled meaninglessly for the rest of the elevator ride, desperately trying to fill the time and failing to hide his own nerves. When they reached the top floor and opened the door, he saw Pete sitting studying at his desk. He gave a huge sigh of relief. After watching Justin enter the study, Chester snuck over to Pete and winked. Good work, kid. I made a fool of myself in that elevator, but I guess it was worth it. Pete's mind filled with questions as he tried to understand his uncle's inexplicable words. He wondered if Uncle Chester had gone mad. Downstairs in the lobby, Cherry was puzzled. She had watched her father and uncle enter the elevator, and she had run after them with her short little legs. Unfortunately, she wasn't fast enough, and the door had slid shut before she could join them. Her uncle had told her to go to the top floor. But there were 2 presidential suites on the top floor, and she didn't know which one he wanted her to go to. Cherry wondered if it was possible that Daddy might be the dummy next door Mummy had told her about. She decided to go to the top floor to look for her father anyway. She could ask him why he had made her and her mum move to a different room. Is it because he didn't like us anymore? With that in mind, she entered the elevator, pushed herself up on tiptoe, and pressed the button to send the elevator to the top floor. Hotel Finest's management was very strict. Guests had to use their room cards in the elevator too. As she wasn't staying in one of the top floor suites anymore, Cherry couldn't access the top level of the building by swiping her new card through the reader. She pouted unhappily. After thinking about it, she decided to return for now to the 38th floor, where her new room was. She could go up the stairs from there. But as soon as she got out of the elevator, she ran into Nora. When Cherry saw the look on Nora's face, she decided on the spot to change her plans. She could still look for Daddy tomorrow, but her mummy was obviously upset and in need of comfort. Nora had called several private investigators, but there was still no leads. If Angela really didn't know where her son was, then her father might be the only one who knew the truth. But negotiating with him for any information would be difficult. He was no simple-minded fool like Angela. Breaking through her swirling thoughts, a small figure jumped over and hugged her leg. "Mummy, I love you so much." Glad for the interruption, Nora rubbed Cherry's head and asked softly, "Where did you go? Did you have fun with Mrs. Lewis?" Cherry looked at her fingers. She didn't dare look Nora in the eye as she lied. "We just walked around the hotel. It isn't any fun here at all. Mummy, let's go to bed." Nora sighed and opened the door. Okay. Then she turned around to see Cherry leaning against the wall and striking a pose like a model. "Mummy, if you miss my brother, then you can just look at me. He probably looks just like me. We're twins after all." Nora chuckled. "Oh, sweetheart. Boy-girl twins aren't identical. Just like ordinary siblings, it's very difficult for them to look exactly the same." Cherry dramatically hung her head in disappointment. "Aw, I thought he would look just like me." Nora laughed and brought her into the room. After taking a bath, the two got ready for bed. Nora's cell phone rang. The call was from the Smiths. She cast her eyes down and contemplated for a moment whether or not to answer. Making her decision, she turned off the cell phone and went to sleep next to her daughter. When Nora woke up the next day, Cherry had already quietly gotten out of bed and was playing with Mrs. Lewis outside. Nora took a look at her cell phone. Aside from dozens of missed calls from the Smiths, there was also one from her Aunt Irene. Irene, who was her aunt on her father's side of the family, had been the kindest to her during all these years. It was because of her that Nora still had a good relationship with her cousin Lisa. Thinking she would get to speak with Irene, Nora returned the call. Someone picked up very quickly, but it was her father's voice that rang out, not Irene's. "Well, here I was, thinking that you'd already abandoned the family, Nora." She rolled her eyes lazily and got out of bed to get something to eat. "What's up?" "Don't give me your attitude. What happened yesterday? Did you sabotage Anthony's proposal to your sister? She said you attacked her. You've been saying for years that you wanted to cancel your engagement. Now that you've gotten your way, why are you trying to get Anthony back again? He's Angela's now." Nora sighed. It had always been like this, ever since she had been young. The moment she and Angela had a disagreement, Henry would blame her without even trying to find out the truth. She was depressingly used to it. She said calmly, "Then why didn't he propose to her?" "He was going to, but you've messed everything up now. Come back right now and apologize to your sister. Otherwise, don't blame me if I disown you." "Do what you want." Nora was about to hang up, but Henry yelled angrily, "You ungrateful, disobedient brat. This is no time for your attitude. We're in the middle of an emergency with your aunt. Do you even care?" Nora paused. "What's wrong with her? She has a brain tumor. If you have any decency left, then come to the hospital in town. Otherwise, you'll miss your chance to see your aunt for the last time." "I'll be right over." After hanging up, Nora quickly washed up, changed, and went out. When the elevator arrived, there were already 2 smartly dressed women inside. Nora entered and made sure the button for the lobby had been pushed. She leant against the wall and kept her eyes glued to the floor on the ride down. She overheard the discussion between the 2 other women. "Isn't it inappropriate for us to treat him like that? Surely it's corporal punishment." "Don't be ridiculous. We were sent by the old lady. Besides, he didn't even cry. He doesn't talk much at all. I've heard he might be autistic. He just behaves so badly. I have to admit, it felt a little good when I saw him be reprimanded. Being rich is no excuse. He still has to listen to us. But what if the father finds out? He will only find out if Pete doesn't finish his homework, and then that will be Pete's fault. That man is very strict with his son. He might be angry if Pete makes a fuss, but the child is so quiet and stubborn. Even if I didn't give him lunch, I bet he wouldn't say a word about it to his father." When the elevator arrived on the first floor, the 2 tutors walked out and went to eat in the hotel restaurant. Nora, who exited the elevator behind them, frowned. She felt exceptionally uncomfortable. The elevator had brought the women down to her floor, so they could only have come from the presidential suite on the top floor. That could only mean they had definitely been talking about Justin Hunt's son. Nora cast her eyes down and decided to mind her own business. The cab she had called for had already arrived. She was about to get in the car when she heard a commotion behind her. Sure enough, it was Justin, who had come out with his bodyguards. Nora looked away and got in the car. Before the car started, she thought back to the sight of the child being carried along with his head buried in Justin's shoulder. Although she hadn't gotten a clear view of his face, the child had looked about the same size as Cherry. He was likely about the same age as her. Anger welled up in Nora. She told the driver to wait, opened the car door, got out, and walked straight toward Justin. She was stopped by his bodyguards before she got close. Lawrence had already spotted her on her way over. He said mockingly, "Miss Smith, I'm sure you'd like to express your gratitude to Mr. Hunt for his help yesterday. I bet you'd also like to ask for his contact information. We've already seen these methods 1,000,000 times. I wish you'd try something more original." Nora was puzzled. In the distance, Justin, dressed in a black suit, kept looking straight ahead and climbed into his Bentley. He didn't see her at all. As the car started up, Nora's eyes narrowed angrily. She rarely chose to meddle. The idea of her good intentions being misunderstood infuriated her. She turned around to leave, but she paused after taking just a few steps. She couldn't suppress her anger. She turned back to Lawrence and said, "Mr. Zimmer, you should have Mr. Hunt visit a psychiatrist when he has the time to spare. Narcissism is an illness. Get it treated." Lawrence was confused. It was only after taking this final shot at Justin's character that Nora felt calm enough to leave. She got back into her cab as if nothing had happened, and had the driver take her straight to the hospital her father had directed her to. There weren't many people in the private facility. Nora checked in at the desk, headed upstairs, and entered the VIP ward. She hadn't even seen her aunt yet when Henry stormed toward her furiously with a contract in his hand. "Nora, you have to sign the ownership transfer agreement for the company today and apologize to your sister while you're at it. Otherwise, it's not just you who will feel the consequences." Nora frowned. Before she could answer, a gentle but anxious voice said, "Are you trying to drive me to my grave, Henry?" On the hospital bed, a gentle middle-aged woman wearing a hospital gown struggled to sit up. Her scalp had been shaved, and her illness had left her looking frighteningly thin. Her cheeks were sunken, but all the physical effects of her condition couldn't hide her kind and gentle personality. She was Irene Smith, Nora's aunt. Nora took a couple of quick steps forward and sat on the edge of the bed. She held her hand and said softly, "Aunt Irene." Irene looked Nora up and down for a moment. Then her eyes turned red. "You look so much like your mum now you've slimmed down, Nora." Her voice trembled as she spoke. "You've had such a hard time all these years." During Nora's years abroad, Henry had never given her a single cent. It was Irene who had always sent her money. Although it wasn't much, it had been her way of showing kindness to her niece, and it had warmed Nora's heart. Interrupting the lovely moment between aunt and niece, Nora's stepmother, Wendy, said, "Nora, your aunt has been pretty good to you ever since you were a child, right? She's sick now, and you're the only one who can help. You won't watch her die, will you?" Nora frowned. A brain tumor. She picked up her aunt's medical reports and CT scan results and started to read them. Wendy continued to nag at her side. "Your aunt's operation is too difficult, Nora. A single mistake and she'll suffer brain damage. Everyone in the hospital is afraid to do it. Dr. Larson, the head of the Department of Neurology in this hospital, is Angela's professor. If she begs him to do it, maybe he'll be willing to take a risk and give it a go." Wendy sighed before continuing. "But now Anthony's saying that without the company, he'll never get engaged to your sister. Angela is terribly upset. We can't expect her to help when she's already under so much stress. You can fix this. If you give your sister the company, Angela will ask Dr. Larson for help. Whether your aunt's operation goes through or not completely depends on you now." When Wendy finished speaking, Henry shouted angrily, "You must also apologize to Angela for sabotaging her marriage proposal, for seducing Anthony out of spite, and for attacking her." Wendy, who seemed determined to try and keep up her act as the good guy, said, "Henry, stop. We're a family. What are you saying all of these things for? Nora, your aunt's operation can't be delayed any further. You need to sign this agreement as soon as possible." Throughout this exchange, Nora had been reading her aunt's CT scan over and over. It was indeed a tricky operation. The tumour had enveloped the blood vessels, so the slightest mistake could lead to fatal complications. Her aunt could die in surgery. Very few doctors anywhere would dare to take on a surgery like this. Nora herself, or more accurately, Dr. Athena, was one of the exceptions. Next to her, Irene was yelling angrily at Henry and Wendy. "Henry, that company is the one thing that Nora's mother left for her. How can the two of you be so greedy?" Wendy smiled. "Now, Irene, that's not quite true. She didn't just leave it to Nora, did she? She was still married to Henry at that time. It's their joint property." "You're so shameless." Irene looked at Nora again. "Don't listen to their nonsense, Nora. My illness is incurable. Even if you sign that agreement and have them perform surgery on me, there's a 90% chance that it'll fail anyway. Don't give in to them. Just get out of here. Okay, I'll visit you again when I have time." Nora put down the medical record and turned and walked out. Her aunt was in a serious condition and could not afford any further delays. Nora knew the first thing she needed to do was contact the hospital and ask to borrow their facilities. Henry and Wendy hadn't expected Nora to just leave without a fight. They watched in shock as she disappeared from the ward. Henry cursed. "She's completely ungrateful, after everything you did for her, Irene." Wendy seemed equally bitter. She lamented, "You were so kind to her, Irene. But in the end, she didn't even want to stay with you a moment longer. Irene bit her lip. Her eyes were red. Finding me a doctor had nothing to do with Nora from the start. In his father's suite at Hotel Finest, Pete was struggling with his tutors. "Why didn't you finish your work from this morning, Pete? This section is completely blank. We can't continue with the afternoon syllabus until it's done. Finish your work." Pete took another look at the assignment. The tutor was lying. This hadn't been part of his assigned work. He didn't speak, but instead turned to calmly stare at the tutor. The tutor curled her lip. "What are you looking at me for? Your father had no problem with these lessons when he was your age. Don't you even know how to do this question? Maybe you inherited your brains from your mother, whoever she was. I suppose we can blame her stupidity if you're not up to this." It was only when he heard the word mother that Pete finally reacted. His jaw was clenched as he picked up the pen. He started to work through the questions quietly. He had already learned how to solve these problems a long time ago. "I'll show them. My mum isn't stupid, and neither am I," he thought resentfully. But as soon as he finished, the tutor said, "You haven't done it properly. Why don't you write out your workings? I've already told you so many times. Stretch out your hand." Pete thought, "Do I really have to write out my workings for such an easy question?" He didn't move. The tutor immediately grabbed his hand, took the ruler, and struck his palm hard 3 times. The pain made Pete's eyes widen, yet he pressed his lips together tightly and refused to make a sound. "This is punishment for not taking your lessons seriously. Stand up. Only well-behaved students get to sit during their lessons." Pete stood for the next 2 hours until his calves were sore. Only then did the tutors end the afternoon lessons. They were still whispering between themselves when they left. "He really can't speak. All right, don't go on about it too much. The old lady has instructed us to take good care of him." "Okay, we'll come back to report to Mr. Hunt later this evening. We'll make sure to report the child was stubborn and didn't do what he was told. Children who don't do their homework aren't good children." After the 2 of them left, Pete looked at the homework assigned by the tutors on the table. He knew that his answers would definitely be wrong again. Even if he completed all the work, they would still say that he hadn't done it right. Even so, he didn't want to speak. He pressed his lips together tightly when he thought of what the consequences would be if he gave in. All he wanted now was to talk to his mum and the little girl next door who was so good at playing games. The light in his eyes flickered again when he thought of seeing them. Unfortunately, the lady next door had been sent away, so she was now staying 1 floor down. 1 floor down. Pete stood up and quietly left the suite. He knew he couldn't take the elevator without his father's bodyguard stopping him, so he crept along the wall until he reached the door to the stairwell. He opened the door carefully and darted in. Meanwhile, while Mrs. Lewis was distracted with making dinner, Cherry was also taking advantage of an opportunity to slip away unnoticed. She hadn't managed to make her visit to the top floor the previous day, but she was still determined to go up there and look for her father. Cherry was dressed in another stylish little outfit. She entered the stairwell, and her short little legs climbed up the stairs with great effort. As she walked, she realized she could hear footsteps coming down from above. As she looked up, she saw Pete walking down the stairs toward her. Their eyes met, and they both froze in their tracks. It was getting late, so the light in the narrow stairwell was rather dim. Pete stared at Cherry in shock. Her eyes were wide as saucers, and her mouth was hanging open. They stared at each other for some time. Cherry was the first to speak. "Why is there a mirror in the stairwell?" Pete grinned slightly. "This isn't a mirror." Cherry was confused. "Why do you look exactly the same as me then?" They fell quiet for a few more seconds. Then Pete hesitantly said, "Are we twins?" Cherry had reached the same conclusion. She was thrilled and leaped forward. She hugged Pete tightly. "Wow! Did I just meet? Oh my gosh! I found my brother!" She was so excited she could barely get the words out. Pete stiffened. He'd always refused and avoided physical contact with others in the past, and he wasn't used to it. It was a peculiar feeling. He should be overjoyed at finding this girl who looked so like him she couldn't be anything but his identical twin sister. His family was getting bigger by the day. It should be heartwarming, but it made him think of when he had eaten dinner with his mum the other night and she'd hugged him. Did she mistake me for this girl? Is that why she hugged me? Was none of it real after all? Pete wondered. Thinking about that dinner encounter, Pete turned pale. He sounded a little sad as he asked, "Why did Mummy abandon me?" Cherry let go of him and hurriedly explained, "Mummy didn't abandon you. It was our horrid grandpa who sent you away. The reason we came back to the States was so we could look for you." "Really?" Cherry nodded repeatedly. She was worried her brother wouldn't believe her. "It's true, it's true." Her soft hands grabbed hold of Pete's and she led him down the stairs. "Let's go find Mummy. She'll be overjoyed I found you, and then she'll take us home. We can all be together again." Pete stopped. "But what about Daddy?" Cherry paused. "Oh, I forgot about him. Mummy definitely won't want Daddy." "Why?" "Mummy thinks he and his family are trouble. She thinks he's annoying." "Does Daddy like Mummy?" Pete replied, his expression hard to read. "Daddy seems to hate her." "What do we do?" They sat down on the steps together. They looked like two peas in a pod as they tried to think of a plan. "By the way, my name is Cheryl Smith, but everyone calls me Cherry. What's your name?" "Peter Hunt. Everyone calls me Pete." "I want to spend time with both you and Daddy, Pete, but I can't leave Mummy either. What can we do? Do you have any ideas?" Pete replied slowly, deep in thought as a plan took shape in his mind. "Yes, I think I do." Cherry jumped up, excited all over again. "What is it?" Pete explained his idea seriously. "We have to make Daddy and Mummy fall in love. Then they won't hate each other anymore, and we can all be happy together. Here's what we need to do." They put their heads together and plotted, working out all the details of Pete's plan. When they were finally ready to head their separate ways, Cherry had an idea of her own. "I want to play with Daddy. Can we pretend to be each other tonight?" Pete also wanted to spend some time with his mother, so he agreed instantly, his eyes shining brightly. The twins said goodbye and then quietly snuck back to each other's rooms, keen to put their plan into action. They couldn't wait to get their mum and dad together and fix their broken family. Nora contacted the hospital's management office after she left the ward. The administrator agreed to her request immediately. Athena was widely renowned as one of the best surgeons in the world. Several of her surgical videos had become classic teaching materials in many hospitals and medical colleges. Having her perform surgery in the hospital was undoubtedly an honor. There was just one condition. The management would want some of their internal medical personnel to assist so they could observe and learn from the operation. Nora didn't mind agreeing to this request. Next, she had to sort the operation site and facilities. The hospital's equipment was outdated and couldn't meet the demands of such a sophisticated surgery. She'd need to borrow some from New York. As it was such short notice, it took her more than 2 hours of back and forth to settle all the arrangements. Only then did she return to the ward, intending to comfort her aunt. She thought Henry and Wendy would have left by then, but she heard a dispute in the ward as soon as she arrived. Henry was ranting arrogantly. "If you want Angela to ask Dr. Larson to perform the surgery, then get Nora to surrender the company. Which is more important, that lousy company or her aunt's life?" Irene's breathing was unsteady. "Angela, I've always treated you well. I'd like to ask you for the same courtesy. Is the company or my life more important?" Angela sneered. "When have you ever treated me well, Aunt Irene? It's always been obvious you liked Nora more than me. Back when you were making dresses, you made us the same clothes, but you must have used more fabric for hers, right? If you'd really meant to treat me well, then you shouldn't have made any for her at all." Her selfish words angered Irene. "Angela, you..." Angela went on. "Also, I know you gave us the same presents at Christmas, but did you think that I didn't know you always gave her extra in private? Just admit it. You love her more than me, don't you? She's more of a niece to you than I am, isn't she? What do you even see me as?" Irene clenched her fists. "I was giving her extra in her mother's stead." Angela was just about to say something when Lisa grabbed her hand. Her eyes were swollen from crying so much. "Please, Angela, put in a good word for us with Dr. Larson and save my mother." She fell to her knees and pleaded, "Please, Angela." Angela shook her off and stepped away. "Don't think I'll relent just because you're turning on the waterworks." "Oh, Lisa, what are you doing?" Wendy exclaimed. "You should be begging Nora for help instead." This caught Henry's attention, as though he'd just thought of a good idea. He said, "Heed your aunt's advice, Lisa. Go to Hotel Finest now and try your luck there. Right in the lobby, out in public. Beg Nora to save your mother. Isn't she staying there because she's hoping to snag a good husband? If she doesn't want to be embarrassed, she'll definitely agree to sign over the company." Outside the door, Nora's downcast eyes turned icy as she listened to her father. When she was a child, she'd thought her father liked her sister more than her because he didn't understand her. Hearing him now, she knew that he'd understood everything all along. There was no reason for his favoritism. How can he say such horrible things so calmly, as if it's all completely justified? "Henry!" Irene shouted sharply. "How can you even consider treating Nora like that?" She turned to Lisa and ordered, "I forbid you to go to that hotel." The vain hope on Lisa's face drained little by little, and she wept silently on her knees. "Get up, Lisa. Stop embarrassing yourself." Nora's uncle, Will Black, told his daughter sternly. He pointed at Henry, Wendy, and Angela and yelled, "Get out of here, all of you. You're all ingrates, all of you. Irene gave her all for her nieces, but not a single one of you is a decent human being." He picked up the bouquet of flowers and threw them at Henry. As he pushed the three of them out of the ward, he saw Nora waiting outside and paused. Nora pressed her lips together, intending to tell him about the operation. "Uncle Will." His eyes were red, and he was overcome with anger. He snapped at her. "You're just as bad as the rest of them. Get lost." Get lost. The door of the ward shut as Will went back inside. Nora could still vaguely hear the conversation. Lisa said, "Dad, Nora's—" "Don't speak her name. Remember how kind your mother was to her? She treated her like she was her own. But how's she any different to Henry now? She's holding on so stubbornly to that company and just standing by as your mother dies." Irene said, "Don't say that about Nora. She's not doing anything because she knows it's useless, even if she lets go of the company. Don't vent your anger on the wrong person. It's not Nora's fault." Will faltered. "I know that, really, I do. But she makes me feel so awful when she acts like she doesn't care." He couldn't hold it in anymore and started to sob bitterly. Nora stayed outside. She could feel their helplessness and anger through the door. "Don't you feel bad?" Henry appeared behind her. "For the sake of a company, are you really going to disregard your aunt's life?" Their disputes had been loud, and they'd attracted a circle of onlookers. Nora ignored her father. She looked down at her phone and sent a text to Lisa, telling her to get ready as someone would be coming to operate on her aunt in a few days. After sending the message, she calmly turned to leave, squeezing her way through the crowd. As she left, she was watched by Justin, who was standing nearby with Lawrence. A relative had been hospitalized today, so he'd come to visit. He hadn't expected to encounter this situation. Lawrence said, "The Smiths are certainly shameless, but doesn't it seem odd for her to be so callous? Why doesn't she care?" Justin frowned and said, "Check if there's anything that can be done about her aunt's illness." With Justin's connections, it wasn't hard to find out what he wanted to know. By the time they were in the car and on the way back to the hotel, Lawrence already had an update for him. Her condition is extremely difficult to operate on. There are only 2 experts in the States who can do it, but the success rate is only 50%. Coincidentally, both experts are currently employed in our hospitals. Justin didn't respond, so Lawrence couldn't help but continue. If Miss Smith knows what she's doing, she'll use this as another opportunity to approach you. When the car arrived at Hotel Finest, Justin spotted Nora getting out of a cab. When she noticed their car, she stayed where she was instead of entering the hotel. Was she waiting for them? Nora was torn at the sight of Justin's car pulling up. She didn't know whether to say anything or not. They got the wrong end of the stick this morning and thought I was pursuing him. If I go over now, they really will think I'm stalking him. But she couldn't help feeling uncomfortable when she thought of Mr. Hunt's son being abused by his tutors, and him either not knowing or not caring. She lowered her head slightly and waited. From the corner of her eye, she kept track of Justin walking past her, surrounded by bodyguards. Impulsively, she spoke. "I have something to say, Mr. Hunt." Justin stopped and gazed at her. His exquisite features exuded aggression. "What can I do for you, Miss Smith?" "I've given her a chance already, so she'll probably start begging pitifully now, right?" he thought. In a deeper, more assertive voice than normal, Nora asked, "Did you do proper background checks on your son's tutors, Mr. Hunt?" She hadn't seen anything with her own eyes, only heard what the tutors had said in the elevator, and so she'd no way of judging whether or not their words were true. But she was too worried to let it go. Justin frowned. He didn't understand. Why is she keeping quiet about the doctors and talking about tutors? Is she too embarrassed, so she's decided to talk about something else first? Justin was a straightforward man, so he got straight to the point. "Do you need me to introduce Dr. Lane and Dr. Wright to you, Miss Smith? Do you want to speak to them?" Although Dr. Lane and Dr. Wright were the most famous neurosurgeons in the States, the likelihood of success would only be 50% if either of them operated on her aunt. Why would she go to them? Besides, she was talking about the tutors. Why was he bringing up doctors? If the tutors were really abusing his son, then the responsibility would lie entirely on Justin. He must have been neglecting the child. Nora replied impatiently, "No, I don't. Please show some more concern toward your son." She left immediately. Justin was mystified as to why she seemed angry, as if it was her son they were discussing instead of his. He watched her leave, somewhat stunned, but quickly came back to his senses. Anger welled up inside of him, and he seemed colder than ever. Lawrence couldn't help himself. "I'd thought Miss Smith was so indifferent to her aunt because she was at her wit's end. I didn't expect she really was leaving her to die. She's so heartless." Her aunt has no chance without that surgery. If they went through with getting the operation, she'd at least have 50-50 odds. It's an obvious choice. Is that woman actually crazy and heartless enough to reject the one chance for her aunt's survival? You know what? Forget it. I don't have time for this. I obviously misjudged her. I never should have meddled in her business. What was I thinking? But still, Justin kept replaying their conversation in his head as he entered the elevator, trying to make sense of what had happened. Cherry stealthily crept up to the top floor. She was just about to enter the study of the Hunt suite when she turned and saw a stern-faced woman walking towards her with a ruler in her hand. The woman said viciously, "Where have you been? Why are you loitering about when you haven't finished your homework, Pete? Judging from how stupid you are, you must take after your mother. Oh wait, that isn't quite right, because you're a little bastard without a mother, aren't you? Give me your hand. I'm going to teach you a good lesson today." Cherry stared at her, outraged. How dare she insult my mom like that? Has she been hitting Pete? She stood as tall as she could make herself and put her hands on her hips. She was about to hurl insults back at the tutor when the door opened. She turned to see her handsome father striding in. Cherry immediately forgot what had just happened. She went to leap forward towards him as if she had wings, but the tutor caught her by the arm. Justin took off his jacket. As per usual, the first thing he did was ask how his son was doing. "How's Pete been today?" The tutor sighed. "He's not done his homework again. Carrying on like this, he'll never understand the more complicated topics. He's so stubborn, he just refuses to listen to us." He's making no progress and is lagging a long way behind his cousins. Justin frowned at her troubling report. Although his son's IQ was excellent, he was introverted and autistic and had trouble expressing himself. He really didn't know how he should communicate with him. He walked up to Cherry, squatted down to face her, and asked patiently, "Why didn't you do your homework?" Wow, looking at him up close, Daddy looks even more handsome. Cherry was so distracted that she didn't answer him immediately. Seeing the child silent, the tutor scoffed inwardly. She was more convinced than ever that he would never cry, make a fuss, or complain. Relieved, she started to spin more lies. "We're really at our wits' end, Mr. Hunt. Discipline and scolding don't work on him. Your only option now is to employ special methods for his education." This caught Cherry's attention. What does she mean, special methods? Cherry pulled herself together and was just about to speak, but Justin frowned and asked the tutor what she had been thinking. What kind of special measures? The tutor sighed and replied, "Pete was born autistic. He doesn't like to talk, nor does he know how to communicate with others. If this goes on, it'll impede his development. I think you should consider either sending him to medical specialists for treatment or to a school for children with special needs." Her eyes shone after she spoke. If Pete was sent to a special needs school, he'd be diagnosed as having a severe learning disability. Then they'd be able to ruin his future, just as she'd been instructed to do. That tutor's horrible. Cherry remembered what had happened before her dad arrived. She looked at Justin. If Daddy agreed with what the woman was suggesting, she'd stop seeing him as a father and would get Mummy to save Pete from their clutches. She needn't have worried. Justin's expression instantly darkened. He retorted fiercely, "Pete is fine. He doesn't need to attend a school for children with special needs. If you can't teach him, then I'll find someone else." "Lawrence?" "Yes, sir." "Settle her wages immediately," Justin ordered. "She doesn't need to come in anymore." The tutor was shocked by his sudden anger. Justin was usually very polite to her, which had made her forget how domineering a man he really was. She had made a mistake. She shouldn't have pushed it so far, so suddenly. She should have taken it slow. Seeing that she was out of a job, she made a last-ditch attempt to complete her mission. Putting on a sincere, earnest expression, she said, "I am the top domestic tutor in the state, Mr. Hunt. My advice is undoubtedly in your son's best interests. But since you refuse to listen to the truth, then forget I said anything. I enjoyed myself very much during my time with Pete. Goodbye." Her speech was what an exemplary tutor would be expected to say. Justin's anger faded a little, and he said, "Give her an extra 6 months' wages." The tutor was ecstatic. 6 months' wages was a lot of money, especially added to what the old lady had given her. Cherry, who was listening to them intently, was pleased. Daddy hadn't given up on Pete. He cared and was protective of him. It was just that he'd been deceived by that wicked tutor. As she watched her walk happily toward the door, Cherry's quick mind sprang into action. Her big eyes stared up at Justin innocently, and she asked him, "Daddy, am I a little bastard without a mother?" Justin was taken aback. He looked down at the child who was gazing up at him so trustingly. The young, innocent voice made what the child said next sound particularly heartbreaking. "Am I really stupid? Is it Mummy's fault that I'm not as smart as Daddy?" Justin was shocked. His son rarely spoke this much, and he didn't understand where these troubling questions were coming from. He restrained his fury and asked gently, "Who told you these things, Pete?" Cherry stretched out her arm and pointed her chubby little finger at the door. She did. At the door, the tutor's legs turned to jelly the instant she heard the accusation. She could feel Justin's anger and said fearfully, "Stop spouting nonsense, Pete." Cherry hid behind Justin and hugged his leg. She stuck her tongue out at the tutor and said, "Please don't hit me again. I'm sorry." The tutor looked at her in surprise. Is that really the little dimwit who doesn't talk? Seeing how fearful his son looked, Justin didn't give the tutor a chance to explain any further. He ordered, "Take her out, Lawrence." "Yes, sir." Lawrence grabbed the tutor and pushed her firmly into the hallway. Justin rubbed Cherry on the head comfortingly and said, "Can you play by yourself for a while, Pete?" He knew what was about to happen would not be suitable for children. Cherry wanted to stay with her father, but she knew he needed to deal with the tutor first. It was just like how Mummy had sometimes blindfolded her and told her to count sheep when she'd gone into fights when they'd been living abroad. She nodded, "Okay, Daddy." Justin only left the room after seeing Cherry pick up a toy car. Lawrence was an efficient man. He'd already got the truth out of the tutor. He explained what she'd told him. "It's your uncle and his family that bribed them. They want to make Pete into a stubborn, problematic child so that their own children can take over the corporation. The 2 tutors were sent by your grandmother, which explains why we didn't vet them properly. We didn't suspect a thing. We won't be so negligent next time." "But Grandma loves Pete more than anyone. How could she?" Justin clenched his fists and asked, "What did they do to Pete?" Lawrence looked at the floor. They didn't teach him properly, and most of what they did teach him was wrong. They punished him by making him stand, slapping his hands with a ruler, and reprimanding him. There was no other physical abuse, mostly because they were afraid someone would discover what was going on. Justin looked at the trembling woman, backed up against the wall, and headed for her, planting his hands on the wall either side of her head and leaning in until their faces were only inches apart. He hissed, "You'll never work with children again. You hear me? You're done. Get out of my sight." He was shaking with anger at how he'd been tricked and the cruel treatment of his son. But he managed to step back and restrain the urge to put his fist through something. He grunted at Lawrence. "Throw her out." Lawrence's heart trembled at Justin's temper, but he too was furious at what these people had done to Pete. Justin had always loved and doted on his son. It was just that his way of expressing it was sometimes a little off the mark. Justin returned to the room. When he saw the child he thought to be his son on the sofa playing with the toy car, his heart tightened with guilt. Pete had been with Justin since he'd been a baby. He'd done everything for him. Cared for him, nursed him, changed his diapers, everything a father should. But Pete hadn't started to talk. When they'd seen a doctor about it, Justin was told that Pete had autism. Grandma had said that it must be because the boy didn't have a mother and so had no sense of security. She'd said that the boy shouldn't be looked after by just one man anymore. She'd arranged for babysitters, family doctors, and tutors for him. As Pete slowly grew older, he was able to start having short conversations with people. This had convinced Justin that his grandmother had been right, so he trusted her suggestions from then on. Pete was a stubborn boy, and he and Justin were often at loggerheads. The child often made Justin so angry that he felt like giving him a good thrashing, though he never had. Despite that, he had continued to think that this was a phase that all normal children went through. That was, until the incident last week. "It's all my fault." Justin walked over and sat beside Cherry. He softened his voice and said, "Daddy is sorry, Pete." Cherry stretched out her little arms and hugged him. "Everything will be fine, Daddy. Thanks for saying sorry. Can we start again and be different now?" Justin sighed. Then he said seriously, "We won't engage any more tutors. I'll be teaching you from now on. We'll get started right now. How about that?" Cherry was taken aback. She hated having to do homework. Help, Pete. When Nora returned to the room, she found a child she thought to be her daughter sitting on the sofa and waiting for her obediently, instead of playing games on her phone like she usually did. She walked over and kissed the child on the forehead. "You're so well behaved today, baby." The soft lips pressing against his skin caused Pete to freeze. He was still not used to the closeness. "Mummy's so soft and gentle." He stared at her longingly, and then noticed her looking at him with a half-amused smile. "Are you intending to take a bath with me, Cherry?" Only then did Pete realize with a start that he'd been so lost in his daydreaming that he'd gotten up and followed her to the bathroom. He was about to leave, but Nora stooped over and picked him up. She said, "Forget it. Let's give you a bath first." Alarm bells rang in Pete's head. If she bathed him, she'd definitely find out he was a boy and not Cherry after all. His identity would be revealed. Pete blushed. No, it's fine, Mummy. Nora chuckled softly and said, Cherry's a big girl now? Pete ran out of the bathroom in a hurry after she put him down. He stood outside the door and listened to the movements inside. The running water, his mum in the bath, and then the sounds of her walking around in her slippers. After confirming she had put her nightclothes on, he opened the door and saw her lying on the bed. With her eyes closed, she said, Mummy has a very important operation in 2 days, Cherry. I need a crazy amount of sleep, so I'm going to bed now, okay? Okay, Mummy. His sister had told him that Mummy had poor health, and her hobby was sleeping. He knew she needed to sleep a lot, and that he mustn't disturb her if she had to prepare for an important operation. 2 minutes later, he heard steady breathing coming from the bed, and he tiptoed over to his mother. He climbed onto the bed, found a spot in Nora's arms, and curled up close to her. Before he knew it, he'd fallen into a deep sleep listening to her heartbeat. This is wonderful, he thought sleepily as he drifted off. I have a mum at last. He didn't see the SOS messages from Cherry on his phone in his pocket. Help, Pete. Let's swap back again, Pete. I don't love Daddy anymore. Cherry sent Pete another message when Justin wasn't looking. Still receiving no reply, she gave up. She had no choice but to start tackling her assignments. She bit her pen and stared at the math textbooks, her face wrinkled as she tried to make sense of it. As she'd lived abroad and was still young, she was still learning to read. She couldn't understand the questions in the book at all. Justin sat next to her when he returned. It had been 6 months since he'd last tutored his son. He didn't know what he'd got up to now. He pointed at the simplest question on the page and asked, Do you know how to solve this? Cherry's big eyes were completely blank. Justin fell silent for a moment. He flipped back through the book to where they'd been up to 6 months ago. What about this one? Cherry shook her head firmly. Justin's eyes widened. He didn't get why Pete couldn't solve these easy questions now when he'd had no problems before. He was meant to be clever. The tutors surely couldn't have done that much damage, could they? He hadn't even read the question. Cherry suggested, Why don't we learn about history instead, Daddy? I'm really good at that. I know loads of facts. Right. Justin picked up the history textbook instead and flipped it open. Who was the first president of the United States? Cherry's eyes lit up. She raised her hand and said, I know this. Justin breathed a sigh of relief. His son might have fallen behind in math, but it would be okay if he was doing well in his history classes. But then he heard her yell, Tom Cruise! It's George Washington. Cherry blinked. Oh, right. I must have remembered it wrong. Next question, please, Daddy. Which American politician was assassinated in 1963? Leonardo DiCaprio. Cherry immediately answered. Justin took a deep breath and told himself not to get mad. His son had just started talking a little more. He mustn't lose his temper. He decided to try again. Who invented the light bulb? Full of confidence, Cherry answered, Keanu Reeves. Justin looked at his son, who was usually so solemn. He was so much more lively and animated today, but he couldn't help yelling sternly, Peter Hunt! Cherry looked up, her expression eagerly seeking praise. Aren't I great, Daddy? There's still a lot more I know. Justin reined his temper in. The tutors were the ones who'd taught the child all the wrong information. So what good was losing his temper with Pete gonna do? He'd just be rewarding those awful women more. He said glumly, Let's continue tomorrow. Okay, Daddy. Cherry heaved a huge sigh of relief. She'd seen Lawrence poking his head into the room every now and then, and figured he probably had something to talk to her father about. She carefully climbed down and said, I'm going to go off to play now, Daddy. Justin rubbed his temples as he watched her run off. Lawrence entered the room looking concerned. Pete seems to be doing worse than the tutor said. If this goes on, he'll probably fall to last place in the assessments, right? Do you want me to contact some other tutors? There's still time before the end of the year. The Hunts held assessments for the family children at the end of every year. Pete had always been top. That was how they'd found out he had a high IQ. And now his grades had deteriorated so badly in just 6 months. Fury flared in Justin's eyes. Despite Pete's high IQ and good memory, he seemed to have forgotten so much. He had stopped learning, and his grades would suffer as a result. Justin closed his eyes and pondered for a long time before he finally sighed and said, "Forget it. Let's not force him to do it anymore." This was the reason he always fell out with his son. He'd placed too much emphasis on education. He realized now that Pete's mental health was more important than anything else. Even if he really had forgotten everything that he'd learned and came last place in exams every time, they'd just live from day to day from now on. He would pave the way for Pete's future. Justin, who was usually so bold, hesitated for a moment. Then he asked Lawrence, "Have you found Pete different today?"